Welcome to Light Overheat with Professor David Yamani. This week I have a video of the presentation I made at the University of Connecticut at Hartford on the evolution, contours, and consequences of America's defensive gun culture. It's about 16 minutes long, so it's longer than a normal video on this channel, but I hope you find that worthwhile. Of course, I want to thank Carrie for all of her hard work in organizing this amazing event, and also to Cass, Jennifer, and Carrie for inviting me to be a part of it, because I'm actually not a very natural fit for what this volume is about. And so as I was preparing my remarks, I had, as often happens, an earworm got into my head, a song that will be familiar to those of you who are of a certain age from Sesame Street. So, one of these things is not like the others. One of these things just doesn't belong. If you guess this one is not like the others, then you're absolutely right. I am the William Hung of sociology in terms of my singing, so I appreciate you bearing with me, but not just because I am wearing a tie, but also really to be in a room with 27 or so of the greatest gun violence prevention scholars in the world, and me. But I was asked to talk about the evolution of American gun culture, and so I'll try to do that. And so in terms of the evolution of gun culture, I really have this heuristic. It's, of course, like any heuristic, a simplification of the complex reality of the evolution of gun culture in America, but I think it captures the broad outlines of what we're looking at, sort of going from a baseline reality of the practical nature of guns as tools in the early part of American history, evolving into more of a recreational focus, and then, of course, today the dominant core of American gun culture focuses on armed self-defense. So I'll talk a little bit about each one of these. I'll focus a lot more on sort of the contours of gun culture 2.0, the contemporary defensive gun culture, and then just point at, very briefly, a couple of what I take to be the consequences of this. So in terms of the practical baseline reality, I won't talk about it today, but in the paper I note that the reality of projectile weaponry, I mean, really going back to rocks in the hands of our early ancestors, but more advanced technologies of projectile weaponry, is as old as Homo sapiens, right? So we're talking 200 to 300,000 years old, and a continuous trend of the possession and use of projectile weaponry among Homo sapiens. But the story I tell most is the arrival of those colonists in 1607 in Jamestown, and they brought with them these practical tools of survival for the frontier in terms of harvesting food, in terms of personal, family, and community self-defense. Of course, these were also tools of offense in terms of oppressing enslaved people and expansion of that frontier beyond the original colonies. And also, we have to recognize that these were tools of resistance to tyranny in the Revolutionary period. So I say, this aspect of guns in America continues today. There are still people for whom guns really are practical tools, just as historically defense was part of gun culture. But we do see in the 19th century, sometime, I put it just at the middle of the 19th century for convenience, we see the emergence of a recreational gun culture. So people continue to hunt for food, but at the same time, they also hunt for recreation. And if we see, in some cases, the amount of game that's being harvested, it goes well beyond consumption. So indicating that people are out competing, for example, to see who can shoot the most squirrels. And this generally then slides into a sort of sporting use in terms of target shooting, competition shooting. We see trap shooting of live pigeons, and then the development of glass feather-filled balls for targets. And of course, today we see clay targets for the same use. And then as we move into the 20th century, with the emergence of consumer capitalism, we see people getting involved in gun collecting. This, of course, also related to the global conflicts in which there were massive amounts of firearms that were produced and then became surplus, which people began to collect. And I think this dominant trend, what I call gun culture 1.0, hunting and recreational shooting, continues largely to be the core of American gun culture into the 21st century. I say 2010, but as we'll see when we talk about the rise of gun culture 2.0, the defensive gun culture, which is the core of gun culture today, certainly that began prior to 2010, but the shift, I think, was complete easily, we can say, by 2010. So again, seeds planted for this defensive gun culture in the 1960s, a period of great social unrest and social uncertainty. Not surprisingly, the great gun buying spree that we've seen in the last couple of years, also in a period of social unrest and social uncertainty. But those seeds began to bud in the 1970s with the rise of the civilian defensive gun training industry. And of course, the 1980s, we see the concealed carry law liberalization that's carried through to the present, and really flowering in the 1990s to the present. So in terms of the rise and the contours of this defensive gun culture, I've talked about sort of four different aspects or four different pieces of data that we can look at to see that. So public opinion, the concealed carry revolution, handgun prevalence, and advertising. So in terms of public opinion data, this information would be no surprise to anybody in this room, but it's interesting to note that as late as 1999, we see about a quarter of people, when sort of given a forced choice question of saying, why do you own firearms, say they primarily own firearms for defensive purposes. By 2013, that's grown considerably, but it's still a minority of people. But certainly any survey that's been done in the last couple of years is going to find more along the lines of 60% of people saying the primary reason for gun ownership is for personal protection or self-defense. The concealed carry revolution, as you're looking at this wave of shall issue laws that swept across the country, again now followed by a wave of permitless carry laws. This GIF really represents that pretty well, but let me add just a couple of additional notes as you're looking at that. So today, about a third of the US population lives in the 24 permitless carry states, and a quarter of the population lives in the 9 shall issue states. The balance living, in 9 may issue states, and the balance living in shall issue states. So the majority of the US population lives in these liberalized gun carry states. And then according to John Lott's estimates, and like you, I don't often quote John Lott's work, but I think his estimates of concealed carry permits are fairly reasonable, and they're certainly the best that we have. He's now estimating 21.5 million people with concealed carry permits, which is over 8% of the US population, and growing every year, which is remarkable in the sense that many of those people live in permitless carry states. So they don't have to have permits. Of course, there are legal incentives that would encourage people to get permits even in permitless carry states. But these are some fairly remarkable figures. Okay. People have always carried firearms concealed. We started banning concealed carry in the early 19th century because people were carrying concealed weapons. And in the social unrest and social uncertainty of the late 19th century, in urban areas, we know people were carrying firearms concealed, often illegally. But in the survey from the 1970s asking gun owners, do you carry your handgun or pistol outside the home? We have about 29% of handgun owners saying yes. The 2017 Pew survey finds more along the line. I can't even see my own slide. 57% of handgun owners say that they carry their firearm outside the home at least some of the time. Of course, not surprisingly, if people are carrying handguns, we're going to see handguns being more prevalent in the population. So again, small concealable handguns were not invented in 2005 with the Ruger LCP, but when we look at handgun ownership in gun-owning households, we find in the 1950s, fewer than 1 in 7 households have handguns. By the 1970s, we're up to a quarter. By the 1990s, we're looking at a half. And in 2015, two-thirds of gun-owning households have handguns. And I'll be interested to see whether in the next presentation we learn something about the prevalence of handgun ownership in gun-owning households today. I would suspect that it'd be more than 2/3.
Where did the data from the 50s come from?
So those first 3 are from the Cook piece.
Oh,
Yeah, from Cook 1993. And then your work, and then your work, and then more of your work. I don't know whether that's part of your presentation, but I'm anxiously awaiting. Of course, you know from the Trace and Alex Yablon's work that the production of small .380 ACP pistols has increased along with the percentage of the US population that has concealed carry permits, which suggests that people aren't just getting permits, but they're at least intending to carry firearms in public concealed. And then the last piece of data is one that's sort of close to my heart because I've done some work on this. Looking at advertising is nice because advertising is a nexus between production and consumption. It also gives us data which is consistent over a longer period of time than a lot of our survey-based and other administrative data. But looking at the American Rifleman over a 100-year period, if we look at the themes that are present in gun advertising, we see a precipitous decline of what I call gun culture 1.0 themes of hunting and recreational shooting, and a rise, especially in this latter several decades, of gun culture 2.0 themes of personal protection and concealed carry. And just to make sure that there wasn't anything particularly weird about the American Rifleman, I did the same thing for Guns magazine from its inception in 1955 forward. And again, we see the same pattern of decline of gun culture 1.0 themes, the rise of gun culture 2.0 themes. And in both cases, the crossover between the two is in the early 2010s. So when I say gun culture 2.0, it's fully in place as the core of American gun culture around 2010. This is some of the reason why. In terms of consequences of this development, I'll just hint at one and raise a question about the other. I think that gun culture 2.0 has the potential to be more inclusive than previous gun cultures because self-defense is a universal concern and that many people will address that concern by buying firearms. So here, if we look at the old demographic of gun owners, the statistically average gun owner is a politically conservative, middle-aged, married man in a rural area of the South or the Mountain West. So basically the characters from Duck Dynasty. But if we look at more contemporary gun owners, particularly if we look at gun owners who only own handguns, right, which is very central to this new defensive gun ownership, we see they're more female, we see they're more racial minority, more urban and suburban, and more politically liberal. Similarly, if we look at longstanding gun owners in comparison to new gun owners, we see that the new gun owners are more female, more likely to have young kids, more likely to be politically liberal, to own only handguns and to own guns for self-defense, and they're less likely to be these old white men who grew up in homes with guns and who own guns for hunting and collecting purposes. Not surprisingly, these trends that have been developing for some time now get reflected in a major way in this great gun buying spree of 2020 plus that you're all very familiar with. So if we look at who bought guns during the pandemic, characteristics of new gun owners, right, skewing a bit younger than older gun owners, half female, 20% black, 20% Hispanic, a third urban, and a half suburban. So those are, that changing face of gun owners is, I think, one of the major consequences of the development of gun culture 2.0. Again, because the concern for protection is a universal concern. Not everyone is going to address it using firearms, but the availability of firearms, the legal context, the cultural context that has shifted makes that a more sensible option for people. And the other set of consequences is actually that part that I'm not well suited to speak to, but that has to do with potential negative outcomes of this shift in gun culture in terms of homicide, suicide, non-fatal, intentional injuries, and accidental deaths and injuries. And this is an aspect of the reality of guns in America that I'm here not to tell you about, to learn from you about.